Who can stop China's surge to global dominance? It's one huge question and one huge challenge that is facing the new US President Joe Biden. Biden has inherited a divided and doubt-ridden America from his predecessor Donald Trump. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping's China is both expansive and authoritarian. It's two rival systems apparently on collision course. So on To The Point, we ask, Biden's America against Xi's China, struggle for supremacy? Well, thanks very much for joining us here in the studio, where my guests are Suji Brumasum from DW's Asia Desk, who believes China has the means to become an even more influential international player. But is the global north ready for a non-Western leadership? Also with us is Felix Li, who's written a number of books on China and worked there for many years as a correspondent. He argues that America's tough stance on China could aggravate the conflict and make things more difficult for Europe. And a warm welcome to Tyson Barker from the German Council on Foreign Relations, who says the Biden administration is set to turn to Europe with new ideas about a common front on China. So how will Europe respond? Thank you once again, all three of you, for being here today. Felix, I'd like to begin with you, if I might. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of people assume that everything would change when Joe Biden replaced Donald Trump in the White House, but it's not quite so.
No, one exception.
Tensions between Beijing and Washington remain just as high. Are you surprised?
Actually not, because Joe Biden already, or his administration already said so, that they will keep on being tough on China. And this is also, I mean, of course, Trump did a lot of things wrong in the relationship with China in his presidency. But that's only one part. The other part, China became a much bigger rival, not only to the US, to the whole world, and especially under Xi Jinping. So I'm not surprised at all that Biden is following this tougher stance. And you can also see that under the Obama years, if you compare it with the Obama years, Obama already said pivot to Asia. We focus more on Asia, but he didn't do much in his presidency. And now Biden knows he doesn't not only have to continue what Obama was starting, he has to be more tougher on China.
OK, Tyson, against the backdrop of what Felix has just been saying, there are a lot of commentators who are saying that relations between the two sides have plummeted to their worst level in many, many years, in a very long time. Is that scaremongering or is that realistic?
I think there's some realism behind that. I mean, if you look at what happened in the United States in the Trump years, Trump was clearly very hawkish on China, used it a lot in his rhetoric, but he, at the same time, negotiated the Phase 1 trade deal, which has not delivered what was promised and has really stalled. In the meantime, we have the COVID-19 crisis, which has accelerated everything. A more aggressive China, greater dependencies, more IP theft, and the population in the United States, very divided, as we've noted, but all throughout the population and in the halls of Congress, there's one thing that continues to unite, and that is the question of how do we deal with China? China is a real systemic conflict
So that is
actor.
the one key policy issue around which America can unite at this point in time. That is...
It's something that I think most Americans and most people in Washington see as something from the left to the right as a real challenge and something that needs to be taken on. The one difference I would say between Biden and Trump is Biden says we want to take it on with allies, with like-minded partners, because this isn't a conflict about countries necessarily or people. This is a conflict of ideologies.
OK, let's bring in Suji. And Joe Biden and Xi Jinping recently spoke at length, for about 2 hours, in fact. And it was a meeting where we're told that they were at odds on most issues. But Joe Biden came out afterwards and said, and I thought it was an extraordinary statement, China will eat our lunch. What did you make of that?
Yes, I think that under Trump, the US has kind of alienated a lot of the international community. And I think Biden, as a newly elected president, has a lot to live up to. He promised to enforce democracy and universal values. And he wants to bring back, I think, the US as a global superpower, a global player. And I think he will pick up.
But he sounded, let me just interrupt, he sounded distinctly ruffled. Some commentators said it was just a quip, this comment about China will eat our lunch. But from my view, it seemed like he was ruffled and very consternated about the future.
Yes, I mean, I think he has reasons to feel a bit ruffled, as you say, because China has, Xi Jinping has said, he wants China to become a technological powerhouse. There's the Made in China 2025, which is soon way on its way to success. And then we have the very expansive Belt and Road Initiative. So China's policy in infrastructure and further developing the manufacturing industry, I think the US feels slightly threatened, and I think Washington does not want to lose the game, of course, and they want to kind of address policy, revisit the China approach, and so that they are not left behind and catch up to China.
OK. Felix, at that meeting that I just mentioned between the two leaders, Joe Biden voiced concerns about Beijing's coercive and unfair trade practices, as he put it, concerns about Hong Kong, concerns about Beijing's treatment of Muslims in Xinjiang, and about its approach towards Taiwan. It's not exactly a way of sort of making friends and influencing people.
No, I think that's also not his point. Or that's he has a lot of reasons. I mean, the Europeans criticize it too, all these points, because this is where China really become a threat. Not only on other countries in the region, but on ideas. So this is a systemic rivalry which has grown and which hasn't been before Xi Jinping. I mean, China was before that was also a communist country, but they were not so aggressive as China has become under Xi Jinping. So I think it was exactly his purpose of Mr. Biden to point this out.
Well, while the US and Europe have been distracted by the massive impact of the COVID crisis on their societies, China has been the lead nation in the creation of a big new free trade bloc that was signed into life at the end of last year.
It's a triumph for China. After years of negotiations, 15 countries in the ASEAN-Pacific region have signed the RCEP Free Trade Agreement. Joining the ASEAN states are Western allies South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. These countries represent 1/3 of the world's population and its global economic output. China also has an investment agreement with the EU. And with the Silk Road project, the Middle Kingdom is forging new alliances and relationships in Central Asia and Africa. Meanwhile, China is vigorously pushing its own agenda. For example, the country imposed sanctions on goods from Australia because, among other reasons, the government barred Chinese company Huawei from building a 5G network. The message: if you oppose China, you're in trouble. How dangerous will China's expansionism be for the US?
Suji, let's begin with this conflict between China and Australia. What is going on there and what can we learn?
I think Australia, for example, it's very close to China. And China has very much closer relations to China in a more direct sense than, for example, the US and Europe geographically and demographically. There's also a large Chinese community in Australia. And however, I think as China is seemingly more aggressive under Xi Jinping in the Pacific Asia region, Australia now, in the last few years, are wanting to kind of tighten also its policy against China and also impose tariffs and be more cautious. And because they are more direct in contact with China and they feel more threatened. And I think that, but the reactions from the region, I think Europe and the US can now kind of look first and use Australia as kind of an example of what could happen if
At the beginning of the show, we had this quote from you where you said you asked whether the global north would be willing to accept non-Western leadership. That was very intriguing. Tell us a little bit more.
Yes, I think that, of course, there's the debate. Washington's kind of putting forth that it's not about fighting China, it's about fighting an authoritarian state, because I think it's a narrative that's easier to catch on to in the global north, where it's something very difficult to dispute, universal values. But I think China is very prepared to expand its influence. It has very strong economic ambitions. However, I think the question is, an interesting question to look at as well, is the world ready for China as a global leader? Because this is debatable, but China is now the first non-Western country with a non-Western population that is getting the title of a superpower.
Well, let's see what Tyson has to say about that question. How far will the West go in accepting non-Western leadership?
I mean, I think that the West is trying to, countries in Europe and the United States, Canada, et cetera, are really trying to redefine that. They don't want it to be geographically narrow. They do want it to be, as was mentioned, values-based. And that's why you're hearing a lot more, less talk about the West and more talk about like-minded countries working together. And I think that that's really the strategic advantage. When you look at how China interacts with its neighbors in its near abroad, let's say, or even countries in the global South, it tends to be a very extractive relationship. These are not relationship-building exercises that build political capital and deepen trust. And we've seen time and again in the past 15 years, the relationship between China and Brazil, the relationship with Africa in the late in 2007, 2008, that a lot of times countries and populations become disillusioned with the Chinese because they're so extractive. So this idea of building an alliance system is something that really is a unique advantage of countries like the United States and its allies in Europe, and Japan, South Korea, which are not obviously Western countries.
Felix?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a mistake by the Trump administration to give up the free trade agreement, which were started in Southeast Asia, but also in Europe. And Trump didn't want it and got rid of it, and China stepped into this hole the U.S. left behind. So this was definitely a mistake. On the other hand, especially the Southeast Asian countries, and not only Australia and Taiwan, a lot of them distrust China. And this continues, although they have a trade agreement now with China, the ASEAN countries, the distrust is still very, very high. And this might be a chance not only for the U.S., but for all this, I would say, how did you describe it, this like-minded countries, to start to think about a common China strategy, how to deal with this aggressiveness which comes from the Xi Jinping government.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, the question is, does it always need to be, does this question ultimately confrontation or communication? Which is the right path to go down?
I mean, it depends. I mean, of course, it would be always better to communicate with each other, but on certain points, it's probably not possible. I mean, what China did on Hong Kong, to give up or and other examples, or to Xinjiang, is something where I think there's not much to communicate anymore. You have to criticize it very sharp, and this is what I was a little bit missing, especially from the European countries.
And you have to have, frankly, consequences, right? I mean, consequences in treatment, the international system, the systemic theft of intellectual property, which people have described as the greatest wealth transfer from the West, the United States, Japan, to China in the history of the world. We criticize the Trump administration for many things, but one thing that we can't criticize them for is having, let's say, the courage, and they really changed the culture in Washington, to impose consequences on China, even if it meant that it was going to cause some sacrifice at home.
Is this, at the beginning of the show, we had you in your statement saying that the US will turn to Europe with new ideas about forging a common line on China. Is that what you're referring to there?
I think that that's part of it. I mean, big question is market access. Can we deepen the democratic space and at the same time harden the requirements to enter the democratic space with products, with services, with infrastructure, with procurement, with IP, with data? Are these things that we want to say to China, you know, if you want to provide social media services, 5G equipment, all these kind of things, you have to abide by the rules of the system, which has not been the case since they entered the WTO in 2000.
Suji, I saw one headline this week, EU caught between the fronts of China and the US. Is that how you might see it?
Yes, I think that is, you could describe it like that, because I think there's Washington, there's the US on one hand, and there's also Europe. And within Europe, there are many different countries that have different takes on the China strategy. For example, Germany is, in comparison to the US, is more, I would say, lenient, more open towards China, because Germany sees a lot of business interest in China, and it has a very strong trading relationship. And I think Germany's always caught, for example, Merkel, she's always caught in between protecting business interests versus the human interests and human rights and democratic values. And I think that Europe is deciding how much they're weighing, you know, will we prioritize business, trade, economic development with China, or will we take a step back and look at the human rights situation in China?
Tyson, you're nodding.
I agree. I mean, the bottom line is the path to a united or any kind of coherent European China strategy or policy goes right through Berlin. Berlin is going to be determinant, as it was in the case of the Comprehensive Investment Agreement, and it has to strike that balance between its economic interests, which are growing with China and dependencies, and the human rights and values questions.
OK. We haven't talked yet about Taiwan. Beijing, of course, views Taiwan as an indivisible part of its territory. Taiwan, for its part, wants greater independence. It's going to be interesting to see who wins out. Let's have a look.
Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen visits one of the country's largest military bases. According to this bold statement, Taiwan is prepared for a possible attack by the Chinese. After all, Chinese fighter jets continue to invade Taiwan's airspace. The Coast Guard operating near this group of Taiwanese islands also feels this growing tension. Ships are dumping sand, presumably for construction projects in mainland China, and nerves are running high. Residents are scared because they don't know why so many ships from mainland China are showing up here all of a sudden, so of course they're worried. Experts call this gray zone tactics, or provocations without open combat that are still threatening. The U.S. under former President Donald Trump has clearly opposed China in this ongoing conflict. The same is true of the ever-escalating dispute over the other island groups on the strategically important trade route between Asia and the rest of the world. In an emergency, will the U.S. risk war for the sovereignty of Taiwan and other Asian countries?
Yeah, big questions being asked about Taiwan. We touched on it already. Some are suggesting that we may be sleepwalking into a major conflict. Is that realistic?
Yes, I think it is very realistic, as we can see what happened in Hong Kong the last 2-3 years. Nobody expected, I mean, of course, Hong Kong was already in a much bigger influence under the communist regime in Beijing, as Taiwan is at the moment. But nobody expected that they will really destroy Hong Kong's democracy in such a fast way, the way the Chinese government Beijing did. And it's sort of also a failure of the West that they didn't pay enough attention and that they didn't take enough hard stance on Beijing dealing with Hong Kong. So, and I'm really worried that this will happen again on Taiwan because, of course, the way China, Beijing really, you can say, occupied Hong Kong and got it under its control, that this could happen to Taiwan, I think it's really, really possible. And as for the U.S., Taiwan has also a very important strategic role. So I think there will be a conflict, and I'm sort of worried how this will.
Yeah, what do you say, Suji? I mean, Taiwan wants independence. We know that much. China says independence means war. The US says its support for Taiwan is rock solid. It's a scary scenario.
Yes, I think, for example, China may, in the future, we will see there are some negotiables, for example. But I definitely feel strongly that Taiwan is a non-negotiable for China for security reasons. Number one, Taiwan is very close, directly. It's an island just in front of China. And so I think China will fight to maintain authority over Taiwan. But of course, I can understand it from a strategy perspective. If Taiwan gains more autonomy and gains stronger relations with the US as opposed to Beijing, the US, it's already also present in many parts of Asia Pacific, in the Philippines, South Korea, in Guam, and having more US influence and presence in literally opposite China. I think China will not let this one go.
And it's interesting with your Australian background. Former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd has come out and said that Xi Jinping wants to emulate Chairman Mao by capturing Taiwan. Again, really strong stuff.
Yes, that is a very strong comparison to say that Xi Jinping is emulating Mao. However, I do think from my perspective, I think in this moment of time, China's priority is primarily economic prosperity, economic ambition, as opposed to political ambition. But of course, this can change in the future. I'm talking about the next few years. China has very strong economic ambitions.
Okay. Tyson, when we talk about China, we tend to use a lot of isms. I made a little list: neo-colonialism, authoritarian revisionism, techno-nationalism. Yeah, is this just a reflection of the fact that the West has a tendency to misunderstand China?
Obviously, isms are reduction. And I would even throw one more ism in there, which I would say is actually kind of defining, which is mercantilism. China is trying to create a kind of hub-and-spoke system through things like the Belt and Road Initiative, through a different layering of new lock-in relationships, also in technology, to basically create chokeholds and access and control issues that gives it a lot more political leverage geopolitically. But the truth is that China is a very complex country with a massive history, governed at multi-layers. There is a huge centralizing effort right now. We see this in the crackdown, for example, on Chinese big tech. Xi Jinping is really trying to consolidate power in the CCP and behind him personally. But it's complicated, and that's why one of the reasons we need more China expertise in the West, in like-minded states, because we need to know what the country is doing, where the dynamics are going, so we don't miscalculate and lead to some kind of instability or escalation that could occur.
And just from the American perspective, do you think that Joe Biden really believes that he can win against China in the next 10 years? Because that's what he set out as his goal, effectively.
It's hard to define what we mean by winning. I mean, obviously, the optimum scenario is that China and the U.S. both exist in a liberal international order that is rules-based and frankly developed...
Classical balance of power.
Well, or a classic, unipolar moment that is, based in institutions. That would be ideal, but we're not headed in that direction. The big shift from the Trump years to the Biden years, I think, and this is their aspiration, is to, basically latch up with like-minded states and see if they can create that kind of situation of strength to push China to kind of stand back from some of this aggressive action that it's been playing, both militarily and geoeconomically.
Felix?
Yeah, I mean, it's if the rivalry gets too big and threatens to escalate, this will be a lose-lose situation for everyone and probably for the whole world. But on the other hand, of course, there are certain points where it does make sense to criticize China, maybe a lot of things, and hopefully under Biden, this gets into a more rational way, the criticizing, unlike Donald Trump. But also Europe has to raise its voice, and find its own China strategy, and this is what I'm still missing.
Okay, you've been watching To The Point. We've been talking about relations between China and the United States. Tense stuff. I hope you've been given plenty of food for thought. If you have, come back next week. Until then, bye-bye and tschüss.